Picture yourself standing before an ancient bonfire, its flames dancing against the darkness that surrounds you. The embers rise and fall like memories struggling to surface from the depths of time itself. This is a story about a world that refuses to die, about gods who fear their own mortality, and about the curse that binds us all. Tonight, we descend into the Age of Fire, where even death is merely a suggestion, and where the line between hero and hollow grows thinner with each passing moment. In the beginning, there was nothing but gray. Not the gray of storm clouds or aging stone, but something far more absolute. An endless expanse of fog and towering arch trees that stretched into an eternity without sun or stars. This was the Age of Ancients, a time before time truly mattered, when the world existed in a state of perfect, terrible stasis. The dragons ruled this gray world, if you could call their existence ruling. They were more like the world itself, made manifest immortal, everlasting, their stone scales impervious to any force that might wish them harm. They perched upon the arch trees, or soared through the perpetual mist, neither living nor dead, existing in that strange space between states that defined everything in those primordial days. But deep below, in the furthest depths of the earth, something stirred. The first flame ignited, and with it came disparity. Heat and cold, life and death, light and dark. The gray world began to crack, and from those cracks emerged beings that would change everything. They were drawn to the flame like moths to candlelight, these hollow creatures that crawled from the dark. Most remained near mindless, their forms barely distinguished from the shadows that birthed them. But 4 among them found something within the first flame's heart. 4 Lord souls of immense power that would elevate them beyond anything the world had known. Gwyn, who would become the Lord of Sunlight, claimed the mightiest of these souls. His very being became suffused with lightning, and his power was so great that even his portion could be divided among his countless followers without diminishing his might. Alongside him stood the Witch of Izalith, who discovered a Lord soul that burned with the fury of life itself. She could weave flames as easily as others might breathe, and her daughters inherited this gift, creating pyromancies that would endure for ages. Then there was Nito, the first of the dead. His soul was an ending made manifest, and with it came dominion over death and disease. Where the others found power in creation, Nito understood the necessity of conclusion, of the final rest that all living things must one day embrace. His very form became a monument to this truth, adorned with the bones and remnants of countless dead. But the 4th Lord Soul was different. It was found by a being so small, so easily overlooked, that history would nearly forget them entirely. The furtive pygmy discovered the Dark Soul, and rather than claim dominion or wage war, they did something unexpected. They waited. They hid. And they divided their soul among their descendants, creating humanity itself. A gift and a curse that would define everything that followed. The lords looked upon the dragons and their immortal scales with a mixture of fear and ambition. These ancient beings represented everything the new world opposed. Where there was now heat, the dragons embodied the old cold. Where there was now death, they remained deathless. The Age of Fire could never truly begin, while the Age of Ancients persisted. And so, the war began. Gwyn's lightning peeled back the stone scales that made the dragons invulnerable. The Witch of Izalith unleashed flames that scorched the arch trees and turned the grey fog to smoke and ash. Nito raised legions of the dead to overwhelm the dragons with sheer numbers. But it was Seath the Scaleless, a dragon born without the stone scales that protected his kin, who provided the betrayal that would seal their fate. Perhaps he was motivated by jealousy of his kindred's immortality. Perhaps he saw the inevitability of their fall. Whatever his reasons, Seath joined the Lords and revealed the dragon's weaknesses, making their extinction not just possible, but inevitable. The battle reshaped the world, arch trees burned and fell. The grey mists cleared to reveal a sky and earth that had been hidden for untold ages. Dragons fell from the heavens, their immortal bodies torn apart by lightning and consumed by flame. The few that survived fled to the far reaches of the world, hiding in the peaks of mountains or the depths of underground lakes, diminished and defeated. Victory belonged to the lords, and with it came the Age of Fire. Gwyn established his kingdom in Anor Londo, a city of gleaming spires and impassable heights. Here he ruled alongside his children and his faithful knights, creating a civilization that embodied the new age's promise. His firstborn son stood as the god of war, leading armies and commanding respect that rivaled even Gwyn's own. His daughter Guinevere became a symbol of fertility and bounty, her very image radiating warmth and comfort. And his youngest, Gwyndolin, was raised in the ways of the moon and magic, their destiny shaped by purposes both political and personal. The Witch of Izalith claimed her domain in the great underground city of Izalith, where she and her daughters continued their studies of flame and life. Their pyromancies grew ever more sophisticated, and they dreamed of replicating the first flame itself, of ensuring that the Age of Fire would burn eternal. Nito descended into the deepest tombs, the catacombs that would become known as his domain. Here, surrounded by death and the endless dead, he established his own dark sovereignty. The power of death was his to command, and through it, he maintained the natural order that balanced the new world's vibrancy. But even in this golden age, shadows began to gather. The first flame, that primordial source of all disparity and power, was not eternal. It burned, and like all fires, it consumed its fuel. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, it began to fade. The lords, who owed their very existence to this flame, would never allow it to die. But what could feed such a fire? What fuel could sustain the source of all light and life? The answer, as it turned out, was souls. Gwyn understood this truth before the others. The souls of living beings, especially powerful souls, could feed the flame and delay its inevitable decline. And so, a system emerged. The strong would claim the souls of the weak. The lords would harvest power from their subjects, and the flame would burn on, sustained by the very beings it had elevated. The 4 Knights of Gwyn became legendary during this period. Ornstein, the Dragon Slayer, whose spear had pierced countless dragon hides during the war. Artorius, the Abyss Walker, whose great sword and courage were unmatched. Ciaran, the Lord's Blade, who struck from shadows with knives that traced arcs of gold. And Goff, the Hawkeye, whose arrows could fell dragons from distances that seemed impossible. These knights were not merely warriors. They were symbols of Gwyn's power, living proof that the Age of Fire had created heroes worthy of legend. They ventured across the land, slaying monsters, defending humanity, and maintaining the order that the lords had established. But not all threats came from without. In the depths beneath the earth, in the ruins of what would become known as New Londo, a city of men had flourished. They had mastered the art of living in harmony with water and ghosts, creating a society unlike any other. But their ambition grew dark. The dark wraiths emerged from New Londo's depths, servants of a primordial serpent named Carthay, who whispered promises of a different destiny. These dark wraiths wielded a terrible power, the ability to drain humanity from living beings, stealing the fragments of the dark soul that resided in every human. They saw the Age of Fire not as a blessing, but as a usurpation, a theft of what rightfully belonged to the descendants of the furtive pygmy. And they believed that the true age, the Age of Dark, was humanity's birthright. Gwyn could not allow this heresy to spread. The 4 kings of New Londo, once his trusted allies who had received fragments of his Lord's soul, had been corrupted by Kayathi's words. They embraced the dark, and commanded the dark wraiths in their quest to end the Age of Fire. The response was absolute and terrible. 3 of Gwyn's healers, skilled in the ways of sealing and mysticism, flooded New Londo entirely. The city drowned in an instant, its inhabitants, innocent and guilty alike, condemned to an existence as tortured ghosts, forever trapped in the ruins of their home. The dark wraiths were sealed away, and the four kings reduced to spectral remnants of their former glory. It was a harsh solution, but Gwyn saw no alternative. The Age of Fire must be preserved, no matter the cost. Yet even as he dealt with threats to his kingdom, darker problems festered in places beyond his immediate sight. Deep in the painted world, a place existing separate from the normal flow of reality, a young half-dragon named Priscilla was hidden away. She was a descendant of Seath, born with the power of Life Hunt, an ability so dangerous it could drain the very life from gods themselves. Rather than destroy her, Gwyn had her sealed in the painted world, a prison that was also a sanctuary where she could exist without threatening the natural order. The painted world became a refuge for those deemed too dangerous or too different to exist in the main world. It was a mercy perhaps, but also a reminder that even in the Age of Fire, not everything could be controlled through simple force. Meanwhile, in the great underground city of Izalith, the witch and her daughters pursued their grand experiment. The first flame was fading faster now, its decline noticeable even to those who had once believed it eternal. The Witch of Izalith, in her wisdom and desperation, sought to recreate the first flame, to birth a new source of fire that could sustain the age indefinitely. She gathered her most powerful pyromancies. She called upon her daughters, each a master of flame in their own right. Together, they began the ritual that would create a new flame, a new beginning that would secure their world's future. But pyromancy, for all its power, was never meant to recreate the source of all disparity. The ritual went catastrophically wrong. Instead of a new first flame, the witch created the flame of chaos, a wild, uncontrolled inferno that consumed everything it touched. The witch herself was the first victim, her very being transforming into something monstrous. The bed of chaos, a twisted mass of roots and fire that existed only to create and spread chaos demons. Izalith burned. Not the clean burn of purifying fire, but the twisted consumption of chaos flame. The city and its inhabitants transformed into demons of lava and flame, their original forms lost to the catastrophe. The witch's daughters suffered various fates. Some became demons themselves, others were warped into guardians of the chaos they had unleashed. Only Kulana, the youngest daughter who had not participated in the ritual, escaped. She fled Izalith's burning depths and eventually made her way to the surface, carrying with her the knowledge of pyromancy and a terrible guilt for what her family had wrought. The flame of chaos could not be allowed to spread. Once again, a harsh solution was required. The great gates of Izalith were sealed, and the entire city was quarantined. The demons within would remain trapped, unable to spread their chaos to the world above. Izalith became a tomb, a burning hell beneath the earth, where the witch's ambition had led to her ultimate transformation. But the tragedy of Izalith was merely a symptom of a larger problem. The first flame was dying, and attempts to save it only brought greater catastrophe. The lords could feel it now, a cold certainty creeping into their hearts. The Age of Fire would not last forever. It was around this time that humanity began to bear its own curse. The dark sign appeared, a ring of fire that marked certain humans, branding them as undead. These cursed individuals would not stay dead when killed. Instead, they would revive at bonfires, those echoes of the first flame scattered throughout the world. But each death took something from them, their memories, their humanity, their very sense of self. The process was gradual and cruel. An undead might die and return dozens of times, slowly losing pieces of themselves with each resurrection. Eventually, they would lose so much that they became hollow, mindless, aggressive creatures driven only by base instincts and a desperate hunger for humanity. The living began to fear the undead, seeing them as harbingers of the flame's decline. Undead were rounded up and sent to the northern lands, to the undead asylum where they could be contained away from normal society. Here they would wait, either finding purpose in maintaining their sanity, or slowly succumbing to the hollowing process until they became just another shambling corpse. But why did the dark sign appear? What was its purpose? The answer lay in humanity itself. Remember the dark soul, divided among the descendants of the furtive pygmy? That darkness within humans was anathema to the age of fire. As the first flame faded, the darkness in humanity grew stronger, threatening to overwhelm the light. The dark sign was a seal, a brand that bound the darkness within humans, preventing it from emerging and hastening the flame's decline. But seals can break. And when they did, the undead would not only lose their minds, they would unleash the darkness within, potentially accelerating the very thing the dark sign was meant to prevent. Gwyn watched all of this unfold with growing desperation. His kingdom, once a beacon of divine might, now showed cracks in its perfect facade. The Witch of Izalith had become a monster. New Londo lay drowned and haunted. The undead curse spread despite all efforts to contain it. And through it all, the first flame continued its slow, inexorable decline. In the kingdom of Ulachile, far from Anorlando's gleaming towers, humanity had built something remarkable. They were not warriors like Gwyn's knights, nor pyromancers like the daughters of Izalith. The people of Ulachile were scholars and sorcerers who pursued knowledge of the ancient arts, particularly the manipulation of light and illusion. Their kingdom flourished in peace, hidden within forests that seemed to exist slightly apart from the rest of the world. But peace, in the Age of Fire, was always temporary. Deep beneath Ulachile, in forgotten dungeons that predated even the kingdom itself, something ancient stirred. The people of Ulachile, in their endless pursuit of knowledge, had made a catastrophic mistake. They had disturbed a grave that should have remained sealed for all eternity, the resting place of a primeval human, one of the first to receive fragments of the dark soul. This being had been human once, perhaps even one of the furtive pygmies' first children. But time and isolation had transformed them into something else entirely. Tortured, broken, driven mad by loneliness and the passage of countless ages, their humanity had grown wild and uncontrolled. When Ulacile's sorcerers awakened this creature, seeking the secrets of the dark, they unleashed a nightmare that would consume everything they had built. The primeval human's name was Manus, and he became the father of the abyss. His humanity, that fragment of the dark soul, had festered and multiplied over the eons. When it finally broke free, it did not emerge as simple darkness. It erupted as the abyss itself, a void of pure dark that swallowed light, life, and sanity. This was not the gentle darkness of night or shadow. This was oblivion given form, a hunger that consumed everything it touched and transformed it into something twisted and wrong. The abyss spread through Ulasai like a plague. Those caught in its tendrils underwent horrific mutations. The kingdom's proud sorcerers, who had sought to understand the dark, found themselves twisted into bloated, shambling monstrosities. The citizens became corrupted, their bodies warped into grotesque forms that barely resembled their original shapes. Even the land itself began to change, reality breaking down as the abyss consumed the boundaries between what was and what should never be. In his madness, Manus reached out across time itself, his power so immense that it transcended normal causality. He grasped at anything that might fill the void of his loneliness, and his desperate searching pulled a young princess from another era entirely. Princess Dusk of Ulachile found herself trapped in this nightmare, a prisoner of a creature whose torment had made him forget what it meant to be human. The crisis could not be ignored. Anorlando received word of Ulachile's plight, and Gwyn knew he had to act. The abyss was everything the Age of Fire stood against, It was the dark made manifest, proof that humanity's true nature was not compatible with the world of light the Lords had created. If it spread beyond Ulachile, it could undo everything. So Gwyn sent his finest knight. Artorias the Abyss Walker, one of the legendary Four Knights, received the command to travel to Ulachile and end the threat of Manus. Artorias had earned his title in New Londo, where he had developed the ability to traverse the abyss without being immediately consumed by its corruption. This power came partially from his own strength of will, but also from a special ring. The Covenant of Artorias, crafted specifically to allow its bearer to walk through the abyss as if it were solid ground. Gwyn trusted that if anyone could defeat Manus and save Ulachile, it was Artorias. The knight traveled to the doomed kingdom with his faithful companion, a young wolf named Seath. This was not merely a pet, but a true companion in arms, a creature of intelligence and loyalty that had fought beside Artorias in countless battles. Together, they ventured into the heart of the spreading darkness, seeking the source of the corruption. But Artorias had never encountered anything like Manus. The abyss of New Londo had been contained, limited. This was different. This was the abyss at its birthplace, raw and overwhelming, fed by the tormented fury of its progenitor. As Artorias descended deeper into the corrupted lands, the darkness pressed against him with a weight that threatened to crush his very soul. He found Manus in the deepest chasm, a creature of nightmare proportions. What remained of the primeval human was barely recognizable. A massive, twisted thing of darkness and fury, one arm grotesquely enlarged and trailing with pure abyss. The father of the abyss was in constant agony, his humanity having become a cancer that consumed him from within, while simultaneously pouring out to consume the world around him. Artorias fought with everything he had. His greatsword, a blade that had slain dragons and demons, cut through the darkness again and again. But for every wound he inflicted, the abyss closed around him tighter. Manus was not merely a physical opponent. He was the embodiment of humanity's darkest aspects, and fighting him meant confronting the very essence of the dark. The battle went poorly. Artorias realized in those desperate moments that he was going to fall. The abyss was too strong, too all-consuming. He could feel it seeping into his armor, into his mind, beginning the slow process of corruption that would transform him into another servant of the dark. In his final moments of clarity, Artorias made a choice that defined his legend. He could not save himself, but he could save Seath. The young wolf had fought bravely beside him, but now the knight did something that required far more courage than any battle. He used his great shield, a barrier that had been blessed with the power to resist dark magic, to create a protective sanctuary around Seath. Then he ordered his companion to stay within that barrier, no matter what happened. Seath watched, helpless and heartbroken, as Artorias' left arm shattered under the crushing weight of the abyss. The knight's great shield fell, useless now that it had served its final purpose. Without it, Artorias faced Manus with only his sword, his broken arm hanging limp at his side. He fought on, even as the corruption seeped deeper into his being, even as his mind began to fracture under the assault of pure darkness. But he could not win. The abyss consumed him, transforming the noble knight into a corrupted shadow of his former self. His movements became wild and erratic, driven by the dark power that now controlled him rather than skill and discipline. His armor, once pristine, became tattered and stained with the essence of the abyss. Yet some tragic part of him continued to fight, as if his body remembered its purpose even after his mind had been lost to corruption. Artorias the Abyss Walker, the greatest of Gwyn's knights, fell not in glorious battle, but to the very thing he had sworn to fight. And in that fall, he inadvertently saved countless lives. His sacrifice, his decision to protect Seath rather than retreat, bought time for Ulacile's few survivors to escape the deepest corruption. It delayed Manus just long enough that the abyss's spread slowed, giving the world a chance to respond. But Gwyn never knew the truth of what happened in Ulasila. Communications from the fallen kingdoms ceased. The darkness there seemed contained, separated from the rest of the world by barriers both physical and temporal. All Anor Londo knew was that Artorias had ventured into the abyss and had not returned, so they did what societies have always done when confronted with uncomfortable truths. They created a legend. The tale spread that Artorias had succeeded in his mission, that he had defeated the abyss and saved Ulashile before succumbing to his wounds. He became a symbol of heroic sacrifice, the knight who gave everything to protect others from the dark. His name became synonymous with courage and dedication to duty. The truth that he had failed, that he had been corrupted and transformed into a monster, remained buried with Ulashile itself. And Seath, the loyal wolf who survived by hiding in Artorias' protective barrier, eventually escaped that place of darkness. The wolf made its way back to what would become the Darkroot Garden, and there stood eternal guard over Artorias' grave, where his great sword marked the resting place of a hero whose true fate would be forgotten by history. The fall of Ulasile sent shockwaves through the kingdoms of the world, though few understood the full implications. Another great civilization had collapsed, consumed by forces they could not control. First Izalith had fallen to the Chaos Flame, then New Londo had been flooded to contain the Dark Wraiths, and now Ulasile had been swallowed by the Abyss. Gwyn saw the pattern that others missed. The first flame was dying, and as it faded, the dark grew stronger. The curse of undeath spread further with each passing year. The kingdoms built during the Age of Fire were crumbling one by one. Even his own family was fracturing under the weight of these mounting catastrophes. His firstborn son, the god of war whose name would be stricken from all records, had committed some great sin. The exact nature of this transgression remained shrouded in mystery. Perhaps he had allied with the ancient dragons that Gwyn had fought so hard to destroy, or perhaps he had questioned his father's methods of prolonging the Age of Fire. Whatever the reason, Gwyn could not forgive it. The firstborn was exiled from Anor Londo, his name erased from history, his statues destroyed, his very existence denied. This must have broken something in the Lord of Sunlight. To exile one's own child, to erase them so thoroughly from history that even their name would be forgotten. Such an act speaks to a desperation that went beyond simple political necessity. Gwyn was watching everything he had built crumble, and he was willing to sacrifice anything, even his own family, to preserve the Age of Fire. The Lord of Sunlight understood what many refused to accept. The first flame would die. It was not a question of if, but when. And when it finally guttered out, the Age of Fire would end. Darkness would cover the world. Everything the Lords had created, every civilization built on the foundation of fire and light, would fade into obscurity. Unless someone could feed the flame, unless someone could offer it fuel powerful enough to sustain it for another age. The first flame had been kindled by the Lord's souls, and only power of similar magnitude could sustain it. He had already divided much of his own soul, distributing fragments to his faithful knights and allies, but what remained was still immense. His very being was suffused with the power of lightning and light, the essence of the sun made manifest. He could offer himself to the flame. He could burn his own soul as fuel, extending the Age of Fire for centuries more. But there was a cost beyond simple death. To link the first flame meant to become part of it, to merge one's consciousness with that primordial source of all disparity. It meant burning forever, feeling the agony of combustion for all eternity. It meant sacrificing not just one's life, but one's very identity, becoming less a person and more a piece of kindling that would smolder until it was finally consumed entirely. Gwyn faced a choice that would echo through all the ages that followed. He could let the flame die and allow the natural order to proceed. The age of fire would end, and the age of dark would begin. Humanity, bearers of the dark soul, would inherit the world as perhaps had always been meant. The cycle would complete itself, or he could fight against that tide. He could sacrifice everything he was to preserve everything he had built, even knowing that his sacrifice would only delay the inevitable. The flame would fade again eventually, and someone else would need to make the same choice. The Lord of Sunlight chose preservation over acceptance. Perhaps it was pride, an unwillingness to admit that even gods must eventually fade. Perhaps it was genuine love for the world he had created, a desire to give it every possible chance to continue. Or perhaps he simply feared the dark, seeing in it the end of everything he understood and valued. Before his final journey, Gwyn made preparations. He gathered his most loyal Silver Knights and Black Knights, those warriors who had fought beside him since the war against the dragons. They would accompany him to the kiln of the first flame, that place where reality itself had first learned the meaning of disparity. There, in the ruins of what had once been the heart of the world, Gwyn would make his final stand against the dying of the light. He left Anor Londo under the care of those who remained. Gwyndolin, his youngest child raised as a daughter despite being born a son, would maintain the illusion of the kingdom's glory. The Darkmoon Blades, Gwyndolin's order of warriors, would hunt those who defied the gods. And an illusion of Guinevere, the radiant daughter who represented bounty and life, would remain to greet any who might prove worthy of carrying on Gwyn's legacy. Then the Lord of Sunlight made his final march. He and his knights descended into the depths beneath the world, following paths that led down through ruins and caverns, through memories of ages past. The journey took them through places that predated even the age of fire. Remnants of the grey world that had existed before the first flame first ignited. At last they reached the kiln. The first flame still burned there, but diminished now, a pale shadow of its former glory. The fire that had once blazed with enough intensity to create disparity itself now guttered weakly, barely sustaining the barrier between existence and entropy. Gwyn's knights spread out around the kiln, taking positions that they would maintain even after death transformed them into hollow shells. The Lord of Sunlight himself approached the flame, removing his crown and setting aside the trappings of divinity. In this final moment, he was not a god or a king. He was simply fuel for a dying fire. The linking of the fire was not a gentle process. Gwyn burned. The flames consumed his physical form, melting away the flesh and leaving only a charred husk. But his soul, that mighty Lord soul that had defined him for ages, continued to burn. It fed the first flame, giving it strength it had not possessed in centuries. The age of fire was extended. Light continued to illuminate the world. The god's reign persisted. But at the center of the kiln, where the first flame now burned with renewed vigor, something that had once been Gwyn, Lord of Sunlight, continued its eternal immolation. His mind fragmented under the constant agony. His memories faded into the flames. What remained was barely conscious, a burning thing that existed only to fuel the fire, wielding a blackened greatsword against anything that might threaten the flame's continuation. The Lord of Cinder, they would call him. Not Gwyn anymore, not really. Just a cinder that had once been a god, burning endlessly to sustain a world that had already begun to forget his sacrifice. But Gwyn's solution was not permanent. It could never be permanent. The flame burned his soul, yes, but even Lord souls are finite. Eventually the fuel would run out. The flame would begin to fade again. And when it did, the entire process would need to be repeated. Thus began the cycle. The linking of the fire became not just an act of sacrifice, but a system, a method of sustaining the age of fire indefinitely through the periodic burning of powerful souls. Bonfires, those small echoes of the first flame, spread throughout the world, becoming places of rest and resurrection for the undead. Firekeepers, maidens dedicated to maintaining these flames, emerged as a sacred order. The undead curse, which had seemed like a catastrophe, revealed a darker purpose. Those branded with the dark sign could not truly die. They would resurrect again and again, each time losing more of their humanity, slowly going hollow. But what if one of these undead could resist the pull of hollowing? What if one could remain sane and purposeful despite countless deaths? What if one could gather souls, growing stronger with each victory, until they possessed power rivaling the lords themselves? Such an undead could then make the pilgrimage to the kiln. They could link the fire as Gwyn had done, offering their mighty soul as fuel for another age. The cycle would continue, and the Age of Fire would persist. Whether this was Gwyn's intention from the beginning, or whether it emerged as an unintended consequence of his actions, remains unclear. But the result was the same. A world trapped in a cycle of fire and sacrifice, where the natural progression toward an age of dark was perpetually delayed by the burning of powerful souls. And so the centuries turned. Anor Londo's glory faded into legend. Gwyn's name became a myth, the details of his sacrifice obscured by time and deliberate obfuscation. The kingdoms he had ruled crumbled and were rebuilt, only to crumble again. The undead curse spread further until entire regions were populated primarily by hollow shells that had once been human. The world aged, but it did not change. Trapped in Gwyn's cycle, it could not move forward into whatever future awaited beyond the Age of Fire. It could only repeat again and again the same pattern of fading flames and desperate sacrifices. The undead asylum stood in the frozen north, a crumbling fortress where society deposited its cursed and forgotten. Here, those branded with the dark sign were locked away, left to either maintain their sanity through sheer willpower, or slowly succumb to hollowing and dark cells that smelled of decay and despair. The asylum was not meant to be a place of hope. It was a tomb for the living, where the cursed could deteriorate away from the eyes of those who still drew breath without the brand's terrible mark. In one of these cells, an undead sat in darkness. How long had they been there? Days? Years? Time lost meaning when death was no longer permanent. They had died before, certainly. The dark sign on their body proved that. Each time, they had awakened again, memories a bit hazier, humanity a bit more depleted. But unlike so many others in the asylum, this undead had not yet gone hollow. Some spark remained, some stubborn refusal to surrender to the inevitable. Then something changed. A corpse fell through the ceiling of the cell, landing with a wet thud on the stone floor. This was unusual enough to draw attention, but what the corpse carried was more remarkable still. A key, and with it, a chance at escape that should not have existed. Someone wanted this undead to leave the asylum. Someone had orchestrated this impossibility. The undead took the key and began a journey that would reshape the world itself, though they could not know it yet. The asylum had become a nightmare of hollows and demons. The very guards who had once maintained order had succumbed to the curse, becoming the shambling, hostile things that now roamed the corridors. The journey to freedom was painted in the blood of these former wardens, each one a reminder of what awaited if the undead failed to maintain their humanity. Near the asylum's exit, the undead encountered Oscar, a knight of Astora who had also been imprisoned, though his circumstances were different. Oscar had come to the asylum with purpose, seeking to fulfill a prophecy. He spoke of the chosen undead, one who would ring 2 bells of awakening and discover their destiny. Before he succumbed to wounds sustained in the asylum, Oscar passed on this mission, this hope that perhaps meaning could be found even in a curse as terrible as undeath. The undead escaped the asylum with Oscar's words echoing in their mind. They arrived in Lotr, the land where the great kingdoms had once flourished, now a twisted amalgamation of different eras and places. all layered upon each other like memories, half remembered. Time itself seemed broken here, with different ages existing simultaneously in impossible proximity. They found themselves at Firelink Shrine, a place of relative safety centered around a bonfire tended by a silent firekeeper. This would become a home of sorts, the place they would return to again and again between ventures into Lordran's deadly regions. Other travelers gathered here, some still sane, others teetering on the edge of hollowing, all seeking purpose, or simply clinging to the last fragments of their identity. Among them was a peculiar figure who would become crucial to understanding the deeper truths of this world. Frempt, a primordial serpent whose head emerged from a pit near the shrine, spoke in honeyed words about the prophecy of the chosen undead. According to Frempt, the bells Oscar mentioned were just the beginning. The true purpose of the chosen undead was to succeed Lord Gwyn, to gather the Lord's souls and rekindle the first flame, extending the Age of Fire once more. This was presented as a glorious destiny, a chance to become a hero and save the dying world from darkness. Frempt's words were persuasive, filled with reverence for the old gods and certainty about the rightness of linking the fire. The serpent positioned itself as a guide, a faithful servant helping the chosen undead achieve their destiny. But Frempt was not the only primordial serpent in Lordran. Deep in the ruins of New Londo, in the abyss where the four kings had fallen, another serpent waited. Kathi spoke a very different truth to those who found him. According to Kathi, the Age of Fire was a mistake, a usurpation of humanity's birthright. The true age was the Age of Dark, when humans bearing fragments of the Dark Soul would inherit the world as the furtive pygmy had intended. The chosen undead stood at the center of a cosmic deception, pulled between two serpents who each claimed to speak truth while the other lied. But perhaps both were lying, or perhaps both were telling their own version of truth, shaped by agendas that stretched back to the war against the dragons. The journey to ring the bells of awakening took the undead through Lordran's most dangerous regions. The first bell hung in the undead parish, guarded by demons and the corrupted remnants of Gwyn's faithful. The bell tower itself was a monument to the Age of Fire's fading glory, maintained by a covenant of warriors who still believed in the old god's righteousness. The second bell lay far below, in Quelog's domain, at the heart of the ruins of Izalith. Here, the undead encountered one of the witch's daughters who had survived the Chaos Flame's birth, though survival was perhaps too kind a word. Quelog had been transformed into a demon spider, her human torso rising from an arachnid body of lava and chitin. Yet she fought not for conquest or cruelty, but to protect her sister. The fair lady, whose body had been so ravaged by the chaos that she could barely move, sustained only by humanity offered by those who pitied her suffering. Ringing both bells opened the path to Sen's fortress, a massive trapped citadel that served as the final test before one could reach Anorlando. The fortress was a gauntlet of death, filled with swinging blades, pressure plates, and titanite demons that crushed intruders with massive weapons. It had been designed to ensure that only the strongest, most determined undead could proceed further. Those who survived Sen's fortress were granted passage to Anorlando, carried by bat-winged demons to the city of the gods itself. And here, the chosen undead discovered the first great lie. Anorlando was not the gleaming paradise of legend. Its halls were empty, populated only by silver knights who had long since gone hollow, endlessly patrolling in mockery of their former purpose. The city existed in a state of perpetual false sunlight, an illusion cast by Gwyndolin to maintain the appearance of the Age of Fire's continued prosperity. The massive cathedral, the ornate architecture, the sense of divine presence, all of it was a carefully maintained facade concealing abandonment and decay. At the cathedral's heart, the chosen undead encountered two guardians, Ornstein the Dragonslayer and Executioner Smuff, two of Gwyn's greatest warriors left behind to test any who sought an audience with the gods. The battle against them was brutal, a fight against opponents whose strength far exceeded anything the undead had faced before. But it was also necessary. Only by defeating these guardians could the undead prove they possessed the strength needed for what came next. Beyond the guardians waited Guinevere, or at least the illusion of her. The radiant goddess spoke warmly to the undead, praising their strength and confirming framed words. She bestowed upon them the Lord Vessel, a sacred artifact capable of holding the Lord souls themselves. With this vessel, the undead could gather the most powerful souls in existence and use them to open the path to the kiln of the first flame. The illusion presented this as a noble quest. The undead would defeat the great evils that held the Lord's souls, gather their power, and then succeed Gwyn as the new Lord of Cinder. They would link the fire and save the world from the dark. It was a story of heroism and sacrifice, of an undead rising from nothing to become the world's savior. But illusions, no matter how beautiful, cannot withstand scrutiny forever. Those undead who looked closer, who questioned rather than simply obeyed, discovered Gwyndolin hiding in Honor Londo's depths. The Dark Sun, as Gwyndolin was known, maintained the illusions that gave the empty city its false life. And if confronted, if the illusion of Guinevere was shattered, Gwyndolin revealed a desperate truth. The gods were nearly gone, and the entire prophecy of the chosen undead might itself be a fabrication designed to perpetuate Gwyn's cycle. Armed with the Lord Vessel, the chosen undead began hunting the bearers of the Lord's souls. Each journey revealed more of Lodrin's tragic history, more evidence of the cost of prolonging the Age of Fire. In the catacombs and tomb of the giants, they found Nito, the first of the dead, now reduced to a skeletal thing surrounded by darkness so absolute it could be felt. The Grave Lord had not degraded as much as the others, for death was his domain, and death never truly changed. Yet even Nito seemed diminished, less a lord and more a monument to a power that had outlived its relevance. In Lost Izelith, accessible through either the ruins of New Londo or a secret passage guarded by Quillag's sister, they discovered the Bed of Chaos, what remained of the Witch of Izelith after her disastrous attempt to recreate the First Flame. She was no longer a being in any meaningful sense, just a mechanism of chaos and destruction, her consciousness long since burned away by the very flame she had tried to control. In the Duke's archives, they found Seath the Scaleless, the dragon who had betrayed his own kind. Gwyn had granted him lordship and land for his service during the war, but immortality, the one thing Seath truly desired, remained beyond his grasp. The dragon had descended into madness, conducting horrific experiments on humans and other creatures in an obsessive quest to understand the secret of the stone scales he had been born without. His sanity had eroded over centuries, leaving only paranoia and desperate cruelty. And in the abyss of New Londo, accessible only to those who possessed the Covenant of Artorias, they confronted the Four Kings. These former rulers had been corrupted by Carthy's promises, embracing the dark and becoming monstrous shadows of their former selves. The battle took place in an infinite void where even the concept of ground seemed uncertain, a perfect representation of what they had become, powerful but untethered from anything real or meaningful. Each defeated lord yielded their soul, and each soul told a story of transformation and loss. These had been mighty beings once, worthy of the title Lord. Now they were obstacles, enemies to be overcome in service of a prophecy that seemed less certain with every revelation. With all the Lord's souls gathered in the Lord Vessel, the path to the kiln of the First Flame opened. The chosen undead descended through layers of reality, passing through places that seemed to exist outside normal time, until they reached that primal hearth where disparity had first emerged. The kiln was a ruin of what it had been. Blackened stone and ash stretched in all directions, and the first flame burned weakly at the center, a pitiful thing compared to the conflagration that had birthed the Age of Fire. Around it stood the Black Knights who had accompanied Gwyn on his final march, now hollow and mindless, attacking anything that approached. And before the flame itself waited Gwyn, Lord of Cinder. Or what remained of him? The mighty god who had wielded lightning and led armies against dragons was gone, replaced by something that barely qualified as alive. A burned thing, charred black and hollow, wielding a greatsword with mechanical precision but no real skill. The Lord's soul that had once defined him had been so consumed by centuries of burning that almost nothing remained. The fight was almost tragic in its inevitability. This was not Gwyn in his prime, not the warrior who had peeled stone scales from dragons with lightning. This was a Cinder, desperately protecting a dying flame, fighting not because it wanted to, but because that was all it could do. When the chosen undead struck the final blow, and Gwyn fell to ash, it felt less like victory and more like mercy, ending a suffering that had lasted far too long. And then came the choice that defined everything. The first flame burned before the chosen undead, weak but persistent. They could do as Frampt urged, as Guinevere's illusion had requested, as the entire prophecy had prepared them for. They could link the fire, offering their own soul and all the souls they had gathered as fuel for another age. The cycle would continue. The Age of Fire would persist, and eventually another undead would make this same pilgrimage and face this same choice. Or they could walk away. They could let the flame die, ending the cycle Gwyn had begun. The Age of Dark would come, and whatever that meant, whether Carthy's promises of human ascendance or something else entirely, would finally be allowed to emerge. The truth, discovered too late to change anything, was that both serpents had manipulated events. Frampt served the gods and their desire to perpetuate their age. Carthy served humanity's claim to inheritance. But neither truly cared about the chosen undead as an individual. Both saw them as a tool, a means to an end, and a conflict that had been ongoing since the furtive pygmy first claimed the Dark Soul. The prophecy itself might have been a lie, a story crafted to give desperate undead purpose, so they would gather strength and souls until they were powerful enough to fuel the flame. Or perhaps it was real, a genuine prediction that one undead would prove capable of choosing the world's fate. In the end, the distinction hardly mattered. What mattered was the choice, and the knowledge that whatever the chosen undead decided, it would shape ages to come. The choice before the first flame was never truly a choice at all, was it? That's what makes the chosen undead's journey so profoundly cruel. They were shaped, molded, manipulated from the moment that corpse fell through their cell ceiling. Every step of the pilgrimage, every bell rung, every lord slain, all of it had been orchestrated to bring them to this exact moment, standing before a dying fire with the power to continue a cycle they barely understood. If the undead chose to link the fire, as Frampt desperately urged, they would follow in Gwyn's footsteps. They would step into the flame and feel their body ignite, skin blistering and peeling away as the fire consumed them from outside in. But the physical pain was nothing compared to what came next. Their soul, that accumulated power gathered from countless enemies and fallen lords, would begin to burn. Not quickly, not mercifully, but slowly, feeding the first flame piece by piece, over decades or even centuries. Consciousness would remain, at least initially. They would feel themselves dissolving into the flame, their memories becoming fuel, their identity gradually eroding under the constant agony of combustion. The undead, who had fought so hard to maintain their sanity against the curse of hollowing, would lose it anyway. Not to undeath, but to an eternity of burning. They would become what Gwyn had become, a lord of cinder, a thing of ash and ember that existed only to sustain the fire. And the Age of Fire would continue. The sun would still shine over Lordran. The bonfires would still burn. The illusion of stability would persist for another generation, maybe more. Humanity would continue living in a world shaped by the gods' vision, never knowing that their existence depended on the regular sacrifice of powerful souls to a flame that should have died millennia ago. But eventually, inevitably, the flame would fade again. The chosen undead soul, no matter how mighty, was still finite. When it finally exhausted itself, the world would begin the cycle anew. Another undead would be branded. Another prophecy would emerge. Another journey would lead another desperate soul to this same chamber, this same flame, this same impossible choice. The cycle would continue, perhaps forever, or at least until no souls remained powerful enough to feed the fire's hunger. This was the future Frampt offered. Perpetuation, continuation, the eternal postponement of change. It was what Gwyn had wanted, what he had sacrificed everything to achieve. A world frozen in amber, never moving forward, never allowed to transform into whatever might come next. Yet, there was another path, one that Frampt would never speak of, but that Carthy whispered about in the depths of the abyss. The undead could simply walk away. They could leave the kiln without lighting the flame, allowing it to gutter and die as nature had always intended. The age of fire would end, and the age of dark would finally begin. What would that age look like? Even Carthy, for all his promises, could not say with certainty. The dark soul had been divided among humans for so long, its bearers cursed and branded and kept from their supposed inheritance for countless generations. Would humans truly flourish in an age of darkness, or would they simply replace the gods' tyranny with their own? The abyss offered a glimpse of unchecked dark, the madness of Manos, the corruption of Ulakile, the twisted forms of those consumed by humanity gone wild. If the age of dark meant the entire world becoming like that nightmare, then perhaps Gwyn's fear had been justified. Perhaps the linking of the fire, for all its cruelty, was genuinely necessary to prevent something worse. But the abyss was not natural darkness. It was the dark soul, corrupted by isolation and torment, humanity, that had festered in imprisonment until it became diseased. The true age of dark, the one that would emerge if the fire was allowed to fade naturally, might be something else entirely. It might be an age where humans no longer bore the dark sign, where death became permanent again, where the curse of undeath finally ended because the fire that had created it was extinguished. It might be an age of peace, or an age of horror, an age of human ascendance, or an age of extinction. No one truly knew, because Gwyn had never allowed it to happen. Standing before the first flame, the chosen undead had to make a decision based on incomplete information, manipulated by beings with their own agendas, aware that either choice carried consequences they could barely comprehend. If they linked the fire, they became complicit in the cycle's continuation. They accepted the premise that postponement was preferable to change, that the known suffering of the Age of Fire was better than the unknown possibilities of what came after. They sacrificed themselves to maintain a world that had already shown them its cruelty, its willingness to use undead as tools and then discard them. If they walked away, they became responsible for whatever the Age of Dark would bring. They rejected the gods' vision and embraced humanity's supposed birthright, trusting that what came naturally must be preferable to what was artificially sustained. They refused to perpetuate the cycle, even knowing that their refusal might doom the world to something worse than what currently existed. There was no right answer, and perhaps that was the point. The curse of undeath itself reflected this philosophical impasse. The dark sign branded humans, forcing them to resurrect endlessly at bonfires. Those echoes of the first flame scattered throughout the world. With each death, they lost fragments of their humanity, those pieces of the dark soul that defined their identity and sanity. Eventually, without replenishing their humanity by claiming it from others, they would go completely hollow, becoming mindless creatures driven only by base aggression. But why did this happen? The curse appeared when the first flame began to fade, as if the weakening fire could no longer fully suppress the dark within humans. The dark sign was a seal, a ring of fire branded onto flesh to contain the darkness inside. When it broke, when death occurred, the dark tried to escape, taking fragments of humanity with it. Resurrection at the bonfire restored the body, but not what had been lost. This suggested something profound about the relationship between fire and dark. They were not simply opposed forces, but complementary ones, aspects of the original disparity that had emerged when the first flame first ignited. Fire without dark led to stagnation, the endless cycle Gwyn had created. But dark without fire might lead to chaos, the abyss that had consumed Ulasil. The ideal state might have been balance, an age where both fire and dark coexisted naturally, neither one artificially prolonged or suppressed. But Gwyn's linking of the fire had disrupted that balance, and now the world was locked in a binary choice between two extremes. Throughout Lordran, evidence of the cycle's cost could be found everywhere. The crestfallen warrior at Filing Shrine, slowly losing hope as he watched other undead either succeed and leave, or fail and go hollow. Sigmar of Katarina, the jolly knight whose quest for adventure gradually revealed itself as a desperate attempt to maintain purpose before hollowing, claimed him. Solaire of Astora, seeking his own sun, his own meaning in a world that had been drained of both. These were not villains or heroes, but simply undead trying to survive a curse they did not choose and barely understood. Some sought to link the fire out of genuine heroism. Others pursued it because Vrompt had convinced them it was their destiny. Still others rejected the entire system and joined Carthy's Dark Wraiths, stealing humanity from others to fuel their own resistance to hollowing. And then there were those who found their own purposes entirely separate from the grand narrative of Fire and Dark. The forest hunters protecting Darkroot Garden under the command of Alvina, a talking cat with mysterious connections to ancient magic. The Chaos servants tending to Quelag's sister, offering humanity to ease her suffering, regardless of the larger implications. The Way of White, Thorulan's covenant of faith, believing that linking the fire was a divine calling rather than simply a mechanical necessity. Each covenant, each faction, each individual undead represented a different response to the fundamental question the curse posed. What gives existence meaning when death has lost its finality? Seems locked in an endless, purposeless cycle? Some found meaning in service to gods who might not even still exist. Others found it in rebellion against those same gods. Some sought to help others, while others preyed on the weak to sustain themselves. The variety of responses suggested that even in a cursed world, agency still mattered, that choices, however constrained, still defined identity. The chosen undead's journey through Lordran had been a tour through the wreckage of the Age of Fire's promise. Every location told a story of ambition that had curdled into tragedy. Aenor Londo's empty halls spoke of abandoned glory. Zealous demons demonstrated the danger of trying to artificially perpetuate what should naturally end. New Londo showed the cost of containing threats through indiscriminate destruction. The Duke's archives revealed how immortality without purpose bred madness. The Tomb of Giants illustrated how even death itself could become stagnant when divorced from renewal. These were not random misfortunes, but symptoms of a world that had been prevented from moving forward. The Age of Fire had lasted too long, sustained past its natural conclusion by Gwyn's sacrifice, and the sacrifices of whoever had linked the fire in the centuries since. The world had become a graveyard of ages, with different eras existing simultaneously in defiance of normal causality. Time itself seemed broken in Lordran, with warriors from different periods able to summon each other across temporal boundaries. Solaire spoke of this phenomenon, the way worlds seemed to phase in and out of alignment, allowing interaction between undead from completely different eras. This temporal distortion might itself be a consequence of the cycle. When the natural progression of time is interrupted by repeatedly rekindling the fire, perhaps time itself begins to fragment. Standing before the first flame, all of this history, all of these implications, all of these unanswered questions converged on a single moment of choice. The undead who had risen from nothing, who had defeated gods and demons, who had proven their strength and determination beyond any reasonable doubt, now had to decide what their strength would be used for. Would they become fuel for another age, accepting the pain and the loss of self in exchange for preserving a familiar world order? Or would they walk away, allowing the fire to die and trusting that what emerged from the darkness might be better than what currently existed? The choice was theirs, and theirs alone. Frampt could not make it for them. Kahatha could not force their hand. Even the game itself, in its way, acknowledged that this decision was too significant to be prescribed. Both endings existed as valid possibilities, neither one declared definitively correct. And perhaps that ambiguity was the most honest thing the story could offer. Life rarely presents clear moral binaries, and the biggest decisions are usually made with imperfect information, while under pressure from forces with their own agendas. The chosen undead's choice mirrored the choices we all face, between comfort and change, between preserving what we know and risking the unknown, between accepting suffering for a greater good and rejecting systems that demand sacrifice. Whatever they chose, the consequences would ripple through ages. If they linked the fire, another undead would eventually make this same journey, face these same trials, confront this same choice. The cycle would continue until something finally broke it, either exhaustion of all souls capable of feeding the flame, or an undead brave enough to walk away. If they let the fire die, the world would transform in ways no one could predict. The Age of Dark would begin, and humanity would finally discover whether Carthy's promises had any substance, or whether they had simply traded one form of tyranny for another. But in the immediate moment, standing in the kiln with Gwyn's ashes still settling around them, the chosen undead was simply exhausted. They had been through so much, fought so hard, lost so many pieces of themselves to death and resurrection. They had earned the right to choose their own ending. The quiet after the flame. The bonfire crackles softly as our story draws to a close, embers drifting upward like souls returning to the flame. We've walked through the Age of Ancients and witnessed the birth of disparity. We've seen gods rise and fall, kingdoms flourish and burn, heroes transform into monsters. We followed an undead from a dark cell in a forgotten asylum to the heart of the world itself, where the first flame burns its eternal question into the souls of all who approach. Dark Souls is not really a story about defeating evil or saving the world. It's a meditation on cycles, on the things we sacrifice to maintain what we have, on the fear of change that keeps us trapped in patterns even when those patterns cause suffering. It asks whether prolonging something familiar is always preferable to allowing natural endings, and whether the courage to walk away can sometimes be greater than the courage to sacrifice oneself. The chosen undead's journey ends at the kiln, but the questions it raises persist. In our own lives, we face our own cycles, our own decisions about what to preserve and what to let die. We make our own pilgrimages through difficulty, gathering our own strength to confront choices that will define us. And like the chosen undead, we rarely have all the information we need, and we're often manipulated by forces we can't fully see. But we still have to choose. That's what makes us human, not the darkness within us, not the fire that burns us, but the moment of decision when we determine our own path forward. Rest now, and let these thoughts drift through your mind like ash through air. The fire will still be there tomorrow, burning or extinguished, waiting for whatever comes next. And so will we, choosing again and again what world we want to inhabit, what sacrifices we're willing to make, and what futures we're brave enough to allow. The age of fire fades to embers. The age of dark waits in the wings, and somewhere between them, in that moment of choice, we discover what we truly are. Sleep well, chosen undead. Your journey is complete, but the cycle